I love the idea of induction cooking, using solar energy to cook your meals and essentially allowing you to stay off grid indefinitely. In fact, I love it so much that I have used it in the back of my Land Cruiser, at home, and of course in my camper. Now that I've traveled around Australia for a year, solely relying on induction cooktops outside fire cooking, do I still love it? Or do I just love the idea of it? Let's talk about it. If you haven't seen my previous episode on induction cooktops and how they work, my testing and the summary of pros and cons, then check that out up here. This video goes into detail regarding everything you need to know if you are considering induction, in theory. In this episode though, we're going to be talking about my observations and opinions on induction cooking after a full year of practical use traveling around Australia. And of course, I've come across some issues and some limitations. But more importantly, we're going to be talking about whether I'd go down the same route again and why. But the first question is why? Why do I want induction cooktops in my camper or in an overlanding scene over the tried and tested gas method? And there are three primary reasons for this. No doubt the biggest reason for me is the ability to cook and replenish power off-grid without the reliance on a finite fuel source. Essentially, I don't need to head back into a town to refill gas bottles every few weeks, nor do I need to carry additional gas bottles. I can cook for hours on end and rely on my 1 kilowatt of solar to recharge the batteries back up again. In theory, this means I can spend longer in the remote outback and it doesn't come with any ongoing cost considerations. Secondly, it's windproof. Our camper here has an outdoor kitchen and there's no facilities or much room inside for cooking, but when the weather's bad, we still need to eat. Now most of us will know just how hard it is to get some good heat into a pan in windy conditions on an outdoor stove. The induction cooktop doesn't suffer from this at all. We can still boil water in a storm without issue. And thirdly, it is powerful. That induction cooktop there is more powerful and can put more heat into a pan than any gas stove that I've used on the road or at home. Now, of course, I haven't used commercial kitchen stoves, but it can boil water quicker, cook food more efficiently, and this means less time with our head in here and more time enjoying what we came out to see. In addition to those three primary benefits, there are several other pros that come along with induction cooktops, including a much more efficient heat transfer to the pan, a safer cooking environment with lower surface temperatures, a cooler cooking environment, a better workspace when it's not in use, the lack of safety switches and mechanisms, and of course the lack of gas ventilation, which reduces dust sealing qualities. Now, after a year, all of these benefits, primary and secondary, still stand, and I agree with them wholeheartedly. But there are some limitations that I've come across in the last 12 months. Now, there is no such thing as a perfect setup, induction included. This is evident because if there was, we'd all be using it. But the first biggest consideration for induction cooktops is, of course, the electrical setup. Induction cooktops are powerful at the cost of being power hungry. This Safari unit here is electronically restricted to my setup and still draws up to 160 amps. This means that you need a large, high output inverter to be able to convert a regular 12 or 24 volt system to a 240 volt output just for this appliance. In order to power such a high powered inverter, like the one here on my camper, you're going to need ample battery storage capacity, and the only sensible option would of course be a lithium battery bank that is designed and able to cope with such high power draw. But the power draw and the usage is only one element to this. Of course, once that power has gone, you need to replenish it. And this means that you'll need to do things like get DC-DC inverters, solar chargers, solar panels, or potentially even a generator. It should also be noted that electrical systems aren't usually designed for a single appliance like an induction, just like the case in my camper here. Although I do have a high-powered and complex electrical system to power the induction, it also provides many other benefits, like powering my air conditioning off-grid on hot days, and other higher-powered appliances like kettles, toasters, hair dryers, and thermomixers. Now this here is a large and expensive electrical system, and it would be overkill if it was just trying to power an induction cooktop, but it provides numerous other benefits outside the realm of just cooking. In addition to all of that hardware we require to actually power the unit is of course the issue of actually replenishing that power once it's drawn. Now, given that one of the primary factors for me choosing induction was to remove the reliance on finite fuel sources, the only realistic option was of course solar power. This camper has 1080 watt or just over a kilowatt of solar on the roof, and this can bring in up to 77 amps of input at 13.5 volt, which is very impressive. and I can add a further 600 watt of portable panels to bring in over 100 amps at one time. Now, of course, conditions aren't always perfect, and to be completely honest, it was rare that we ever saw figures quite that high from solar alone. In fact, once we started to head north on the east coast of Australia and into northern Queensland, we found that we would be averaging about 60% efficiency from our solar panels, both roof mounted and portable. These sort of figures were much lower than what we're used to in the southern half of the country, and it was these sort of efficiency levels that we experienced in northern Queensland, the Northern Territory and into the Kimberley of Western Australia. Now, we found generally that we would use anywhere between 10 and 20% of our 600 amp hour lithium battery capacity just to cook an evening meal for our family of 4. This, in addition to regular power usage, including our fridge, water pumps, lights, camera and phone chargers, kettles, Starlink, and again a cooked breakfast in the morning before solar input, we would frequently use between 35 to 50% of our battery by the morning. This meant that if we were only seeing 60% efficiency in our solar input, and given the low solar input efficiency ratings in early in the morning and late in the evening, it would take the majority of the daylight hours to charge back up to 100%, if we got there at all. And that's of course assuming perfect conditions and clear skies. Light cloud cover and overcast skies would heavily affect this and often result in a partially charged battery by the evening. Then add some tree cover, some shrubs or objects partially covering some panels or reducing the input hour range, then we were certain not to be a 100%. Most of the time this wasn't an issue. Although we couldn't always get to 100% at camp, we never really stayed in a single location for more than 5 days, and we could get through on a partial charge. Once we got moving again, of course, we removed any potential obstructions and we were getting in some charge from the vehicle's alternator through the DC-DC charger. But that was just it. Most of the time it wasn't an issue. But if we were in an area with reduced solar charging capabilities or no solar at all, then we could realistically only go 2 to 3 days with our regular use without an alternative charging source. And this is where it became a big issue. Without power, we can't cook. Over the year, there were only a half a dozen times where this really became an issue. And considering that we're on the road for over 350 days, it was a very small proportion. However, during those half a dozen times, it was a very big issue. Now, most of the time we needed the generator to put some more charge into the batteries to keep up. However, there were a couple of instances where we weren't allowed to use the generator and we needed to get creative. Now, of course, we could run the vehicle to activate the DC-DC charger in the camper and charge it up that way, but there are a couple of issues with this. Firstly, this cruiser is a V8 with an aftermarket exhaust, and the noise coming from the engine is probably more annoying than that of a generator for other campers that were nearby. And secondly, the DC-DC charger in the camper is only 30 amps, which is fairly insignificant for an induction that can pull up to 160 amps. To put it into perspective, that induction cooktop on a medium heat for 20 minutes would require this vehicle to be running for over an hour to replenish that power lost. It's just not very practical. Now, of course, we could upgrade the power system on our camper, but it gets to the point where the benefits no longer outweigh the costs involved. And going larger than 600 amp hour capacity and 1 kilowatt of solar on the roof just simply wasn't worth it for half a dozen instances over the course of an entire year. In addition to that, we were already maxing the solar input out with the 1.6 kilowatts when we add those portable panels in. Now, there is one more negative I found with induction cooktops, and it's the largest consideration you should take into account, and that is the reliability of the hardware itself. Everything can break and everything has its limits, and gas stoves are very simple and reliable unless you really go out to abuse them. And even then, if you carry some spare O-rings, some plastic adjuster knobs and some basic tools, there's a good chance you'll get it back up and running, and it's unlikely they're going to leave you out in the bush without the ability to cook a hot meal. I wish I could say the same thing about induction cooktops. Now, after 6 months on the road in outback Queensland, we had our first issue with our first induction cooktop, and that was a faulty cooling sensor in the right-hand hob. This meant that the right-hand cooling fan would not turn on when we're using that right-hand side, which means the electronics would overheat and of course it would turn off. Now, luckily it was only an issue on the right-hand side. We could still use the left independently and we could still use both together, as it would appear the left cooling fan was ample to keep the whole system cool enough, but it sure wasn't something I could fix out on the road. Fortunately, this wasn't a showstopper. We could still use the induction cooktop normally, we just couldn't use that right-hand burner independently. Now, when I went to contact Safari, the manufacturer of this product, they informed me they were out of stock of the unit, and it took over 7 weeks to receive and replace the unit into the camper. But unfortunately, that's not where our issues ended. Only 10 short weeks after installing the new unit, and we had issues with that too, but it wasn't just a cooling fan. Here we have the old unit from the camper, and you can probably hear there's parts loose inside this induction cooktop. So again, I contacted Safari and they informed me that there was a batch of products that went through that had a known fault of a resistor coming loose. But that resistor coming loose meant that we had total failure in this unit. Just trying to power it on would trip the safety in the inverter and reset the whole system. So this was completely out of action. But just as our luck would have it, it also occurred in the remote outback in the south of the Kimberley and just before we headed down the unsealed Tanami Road towards Alice Springs. There weren't any shops or camping stores to drop into and pick up a new or even an alternative unit. Because of the nature of induction cooktops and some of the reasons and considerations that I've already listed today, I always carry a backup stove in the camper. So I had one of these Coleman dual fuel stoves in the back of the camper which we could use temporarily. Now it did make cooking a little difficult with only a single burner, but it got us through until I got my hands on a second one of these Coleman dual fuel burners. Now it took a couple of weeks to collect our new unit, at which time we were back in Adelaide and about to start making our way west. So we finished our trip using our Coleman stoves before reinstalling the new induction. With so many benefits and advantages to induction cooktops and only a handful of instances where it couldn't or didn't live up to expectations, it begs the question, would I do it again knowing what I know now? Now, we had 2 instances of hardware failures with these, both of them causing disruption in our cooking methods and both within 1 year of full-time travel. And that really shook my faith on the induction technology for being a viable and, more importantly, a reliable cooking method out on the road. Now, I will still stand by all of the benefits for induction cooktop. And if I had a choice to use either appliance, it would be induction in a general sense. But for remote outback touring in Australia and reliability, I'd have to reconsider. In my experience in the last 12 months, there really wasn't an area in Australia that it was hard or difficult to find and refill LPG gas bottles. And it is cheap. I mean, it's very cheap when comparing it to an electrical system like the one in this camper. Early on my trip, I purchased a third 200 amp hour lithium battery due to power issues we were facing, primarily as a result of the induction's requirements. This cost $1,800 and $100 worth of cabling. Gas bottles range from anywhere between $15 to $45 to refill a 4.5 kilo gas bottle, averaging about $20 for the most part. This means that we could refill this 4.5 kilo gas bottle 95 times for the price of just one of those batteries. And given our average gas use on the trip, that would last about 285 weeks or 5.7 years. Keeping in mind that is just one battery, and I have 3 of them in this camper, along with a $2,000 inverter amongst other gear. But I will remind you that that power system offers opportunities and it powers much more than just the induction cooktop. Now, I think it's fair to say that if your primary consideration or focus is cost, then I don't think it's a very viable or even a very sensible option. However, if you already have a powerful electrical system, or you have the one to power your air conditionings, your kettles, your toasters, and other high-powered appliances out on the road, then this is just another system that is ready to use. Then there's the reliability. If you're carrying basic tools and spares to service these gas appliances, then there's a good chance you can get them working again in the case they fail, but not with induction. It's very unlikely you'll be carrying the right cooling fan sensors, the capacitors, or any other electrical component that may go wrong inside these units, and even more unlikely that you're going to be pulling them apart to refit them yourself, voiding any warranty. Now, if you're like me and you go out remote for long periods of time over rough and rugged terrain, then there's also an increased chance that you may experience one or more of these issues. So, would I do it again? No, and yes, but different. So hear me out. I love my induction cooktop. I love the efficiency. I love the power. I love the fact that when it's not in use, it's an easy prep area. I love the fact that there's no hinged lids or gas safety switches. The surface temperature is lower, but the pans are hotter. This ambient temperature is cooler, so I'm not sweating in the kitchen in the top end. And there's no ventilation holes in this dust-proof kitchen for safety. All of those benefits are great. And would I do it again in the camper? Yes, but would I use and carry induction cooktops in the vehicle? No, and here's why. The camper trailer offers huge storage capacity, and for the 95% of the time that this induction cooktop does work, I'd be happy to sacrifice just a little bit of that storage room to carry a backup dual burner gas stove that can plug into one of the 4.5 kilo gas bottles that are stored on the front of this camper anyway. This would be used as a backup only in case of lack of solar, 240 volt shore power, I can't run a generator or experience part failures. In addition to this, this camper already has a beast of an electrical system, and I use it for all sorts of things, including running the air conditioning and heating off-grid. I use the kettle multiple times a day and run other high-powered appliances and low-powered appliances for prolonged periods of time. So I have the capacity and the capability to power such a unit. On the other hand, the vehicle is small and storage is at a premium. I don't want to be carrying two types of cooking methods just in case, just because I can't rely on the induction technology. I also don't want to be allocating space for large batteries and inverters and other associated charging gear. I just need something that is basic and that is going to work when I need it each time. I want to note here that my family and I often travel remote on some seriously rough terrain that others may avoid. Now, if you're someone who just travels primarily or even frequently between caravan parks, or perhaps don't drive on thousands and thousands of kilometers of corrugated dusty roads, then I think it's much less likely that you'll experience hardware failure, and you'll likely have more availability to 240 volt shore power to recharge if and when it's needed. Now, I love my Induction cooktop. I love its high power and its weather resistant qualities amongst all of the other benefits and advantages that I've listed today, but I wouldn't go about setting up an entire off-grid electrical system just to power it. Gas is by far the cheaper way to go, and in my opinion, a more reliable way to go. It still gets the job done in the end, albeit a few compromises. Now, a popular way to get into Induction cooktop is just to buy a cheap and small portable unit, and only using it when plugged into 240 volt shore power or using a generator. Here, I've listed some of the pros and the cons of induction cooking long term, with the hope that it's given you the information you need to make a better informed decision as to whether or not it's something that will work for you. Now, this episode complements the earlier episode I did a few years back, where I go into much more detail about everything you need to know about induction. Now, if you're still like me and you really want to get into the world of induction, there are cheaper ways to go about it, and using the Bluetti power station is just one of those ways. I've done an entire review on this power station as well, so check that out if you're interested. I hope this episode has been able to provide you with a more realistic overview or insight into the world of true off-grid induction cooktops and their viability in the camping and overlanding scene. I'd love you to share your comments, thoughts and tips in the comment section below for others as well. But if we don't see you out on the tracks, we'll be sure to see you here next time on Exploring Oz. Cheers.